A knife was pressed into her ribs, and she had exactly 4 seconds to live with whatever choice she made next. So instead of screaming, the widow moved her fingers one silent sentence to the most dangerous man in the city. He didn't blink, and the thug holding her had no idea he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what's ahead. I've got another unforgettable story coming tomorrow. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing people tuned in from all over the world. Okay, let's get back into it. The cobblestones of Callum Street glistened beneath the amber wash of old iron street lamps, rain pooling in the cracks between stones and reflecting broken light back at a sky that offered nothing. Mist rolled low between the buildings on either side, old brick, dark and damp, the kind of walls that absorbed sound rather than bounced it. A car moved somewhere distant, its headlights bleeding faint gold through the fog at the far end of the street, too far to matter. The night was the kind of quiet that is not peaceful, the kind that listens. Isabella Aaron walked as though the ground beneath her feet might give way at any moment. Her deep green dress, fitted at the waist and flaring softly to the knee, was damp at the hem from the puddles she had stopped trying to navigate. Her beige cardigan was drawn across her chest, not against the cold, though the cold was real, but because her right arm would not move freely enough to do much else. Her brown hair, still neat at the crown, had begun to fray at the edges where the mist touched it. She clutched her gold-toned handbag with her left hand, the worn strap twisted around her fingers like something she was trying not to let go of. Her eyes were swollen. The redness had not faded since she had stood in her kitchen an hour ago, staring at a letter she had already read 11 times, and wept for a version of her life that no longer existed. She had been crying when Derek arrived. He moved half a step behind her and slightly to the right, his large body angled inward in the practiced way of a man mimicking proximity without tenderness. His dark hood was pulled low. His worn leather jacket caught the amber light in dull patches and creaked faintly with each stride. To anyone glancing from a window above, they might have appeared a couple walking home late, close together, saying nothing. The silence between them could have been comfortable. It was not. His hand was at her elbow, fingers wrapped with a pressure that communicated everything without needing to say a word. And near her side, pressed flat against the fabric of her cardigan just below the rib cage, the blade of his knife rested in quiet reminder. Not cutting. Not yet. Simply present, the way a closed door is present when someone is standing against it from the other side. Isabella had understood the rules before he finished his first sentence on Grayford Road. She had looked at his face, the hooded eyes, the set jaw of a man performing a task rather than making a choice, and she had calculated, very quickly, what screaming would cost her, what running would cost her, what reaching into her bag for her phone would cost her. She had added the figures in the space of 3 heartbeats and arrived at an answer she did not like but accepted. Walk, stay quiet, think. She had been walking for 11 minutes. She had been quiet for all of them. Thinking had so far produced nothing except the growing certainty that whoever Derek was bringing her to, whatever Matthias intended when she arrived, tonight was not a night she would be allowed to simply leave. The street ahead was nearly empty. Then she saw him. He emerged from the mist at the far end of Callum Street, the way certain men enter rooms without announcement, without urgency, as though the space had already arranged itself around his arrival. He walked with his hands loose at his sides. His black suit was immaculate despite the rain, the jacket fitted, no tie, the collar of his dark shirt open at the throat. The tattoos began at his hands, heavy ink across the knuckles, climbing the backs of his fingers and continued up past his wrists, disappearing beneath his cuffs, reappearing again at his neck where dark lines curved toward his jaw. His face was lean, angular, and utterly still. His eyes moved across the street the way eyes move when they are cataloging rather than simply seeing. He did not slow when he registered them. Derek did not slow either. Men like Derek do not adjust for strangers. Isabella adjusted for everything. She counted the distance between them. 15 feet, 12, 10. Her heart was striking so hard against her ribs that she was half convinced the sound was audible in the silence of the street. She did not turn her head. She did not alter the rhythm of her stride. She did not change the expression on her face, which had settled into a kind of careful blankness she had been wearing since Grayford Road. But her left hand hanging near the folds of her damp skirt, the hand Derek had no grip on, the hand that was free in the only way any part of her was currently free shifted, slowly, below the sightline of the arm locked in Derek's grip, her fingers rose to her waist. And between one breath and the next, in the narrow seconds before the man in the black suit passed entirely and was gone. She formed the shapes she had practiced in the quiet months since her husband's funeral, shapes she had learned not for any moment she imagined would come, but because grief makes people do careful, private things to fill the silence. "Help me, he has a weapon." The man in the black suit did not stop immediately. His stride carried him one more step forward, then it stopped. He stood still in the mist, 4 feet from them, his tattooed hands loose at his sides. He did not look at Derek first, he looked at Isabella. At her face, the swollen eyes, the careful blankness, the way she was holding herself like something that had been told very precisely how to stand. Then his gaze moved to Derek's grip on her elbow, to the angle of Derek's arm and what it implied about where his other hand was. He had understood her fingers before she completed the second word. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational. A man observing something mildly inconvenient. "Let her go." Derek's head turned. He looked Francisco Mora up and down, with the flat assessment of a man who has decided the answer before the question is finished. Then the corner of his mouth pulled into something that was not quite a smile. "Mind your business." Isabella felt Derek's grip shift just slightly, just a fraction, as his attention divided itself between the woman he was holding and the man he had decided did not matter. That fraction was all she had. She stopped calculating. She stopped being careful. She pushed. 6 months earlier, Isabella Aaron had stood in a hospital corridor under fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly wrong, the walls too white, the floor too clean, the faces of passing nurses too composed for what they were moving through, and listened to a doctor explain, in careful, measured language, that her husband was gone. She had nodded. She remembered nodding. She did not remember what her face did. Thomas Aaron had been 34 years old. He had driven the same route to work for 6 years without incident. The police report described black ice and a barrier that gave way too easily for the speed at which he had been traveling. The investigation lasted 9 days and concluded with a single typed page that used the word accident 4 times and answered none of the questions that would come to Isabella later, much later, when the grief had thinned just enough to let other things through. Questions like why Thomas had stopped answering his phone in the 2 weeks before he died, like why he had moved money between accounts she hadn't known existed, like why, at his funeral, a man she had never met stood at the back of the church with his hands folded and watched the proceedings with the calm, proprietary attention of someone attending a meeting rather than a burial. She had not known his name then. She learned it 3 weeks later, when he knocked on her door. Matthias Aaron was Thomas's older brother by 11 years. He was broad-shouldered, well-dressed in the way of men who want you to notice the effort, and possessed of a smile that arrived slightly before the warmth that was supposed to accompany it. He brought flowers, white lilies, which Isabella would later think was either thoughtless or deliberate, and sat in her living room with his ankle crossed over his knee, and spoke about Thomas in the past tense, with an ease that made her stomach tighten. They had not spoken in years, he told her. A falling out. Old business, old wounds. He had wanted to reconcile. He was sorry he had not done it sooner. He was very sorry. Isabella offered tea. She sat across from him and listened, and told herself that grief made people strange, that estranged families often appeared at funerals, and afterwards, that his presence did not mean anything beyond the ordinary awkward reach of a man who had lost a brother he had not spoken to. She told herself that until he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a document on her coffee table. It was a loan agreement, dated 14 months prior. Thomas's signature at the bottom, pressed firm and recognizable. The sum written in the middle of the page was large enough that Isabella read it twice, certain she had misplaced a decimal. She had not. "Thomas borrowed from me," Matthias said, his voice carrying the rehearsed gentleness of someone delivering news they have already decided how to frame. "We didn't speak, but family is family. He needed it. I gave it to him. He was going to repay me." He paused. He didn't get the chance. Isabella looked at the document, then at Matthias, then back at the document. "I wasn't aware of this," she said carefully. "I know," he smiled. "That's why I'm here, to be transparent, to handle this between family." She told him she would need time. Time to understand the finances, to speak to someone, to process what she was looking at. He nodded graciously. He picked up his flowers and showed himself out, and told her to take all the time she needed. He called the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. The third call came on a Thursday, late enough that she had already turned off the living room light. His voice on the phone was the same as it had been in her living room, measured, almost warm, but underneath it something had shifted, the way the temperature of a room shifts when a window is opened in winter. "I've been thinking," he said, "about a solution. Something that works for both of us." She waited. "Marry me," he said. "We'll call it settled." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Isabella to understand that he was not joking and was not sorry, and that the flowers and the careful voice and the sitting with his ankle crossed over his knee had been, from the first moment, the architecture of this sentence. "No," she said. He absorbed her answer with a patience that frightened her more than anger would have. "Think about it," he told her. "Take your time." She did not need time. She needed him to stop calling. He did not stop calling. He began arriving instead at her door in the early evening, at the car park outside the small office where she worked 2 days a week, once at the supermarket, where he appeared at the end of an aisle holding a basket and greeted her as though the encounter were coincidence. Men she did not recognize began appearing near her house. Not threatening, not visibly, simply present, simply watching. He told her at one point, standing in her doorway, his hand resting on the frame. "You belong to this family. You don't walk away from us." She told him again. She would repay the debt, gradually, whatever it took. He laughed, not unkindly. That was somehow worse. "This isn't about money, Isabella." She understood then that there was no negotiation available to her. That the document on the coffee table had never been about the money either. That what Matthias Aaron wanted was something the debt simply gave him a language for ownership, dressed in the vocabulary of obligation. She began planning quietly. A new town, a new apartment, no forwarding address left anywhere he could find it. She gave herself 3 weeks to make it clean, careful, invisible. She told no one. She moved on a Wednesday morning while it was still dark, taking only what fit in 2 bags, leaving behind the furniture and the curtains, and the version of her life she could no longer afford to carry. She had believed, with the particular desperation of someone who has run out of other options, that distance would be enough. She had been walking for 11 minutes on Callum Street tonight, before she accepted that it had not been. Francisco Mora had not intended to walk down Callum Street that night. He had intended to take Grenville Road, which was wider, better lit, and 3 minutes faster to where he was going. But Grenville Road required passing the front entrance of a bar, where, at this hour, 2 men he had unfinished business with were likely drinking. And Francisco had learned early in his life that unfinished business had a way of demanding resolution on its own schedule when you walked past it. He preferred to choose his own timing, so he had turned down Callum Street instead. He would think about that later. The specific, unremarkable logic of a small decision that changed everything. Francisco was 38 years old, though most people who met him placed him older, not from his face, which was lean and largely unlined, but from the quality of his stillness. He occupied space the way buildings occupy space, solidly, without apology, without the restless energy that most men carry in their hands and shoulders, and the way their eyes move when they enter a room. He stood just over 6 feet. His black suit was well cut and worn with the ease of a man who did not dress to impress, but understood that appearance communicated before words did. No tie. The collar of his dark shirt open at the throat. The tattoos that marked his hands and neck were not decorative in the way of fashion. They were the record of a life lived in particular places among particular people, each one carrying a meaning he did not explain to those who asked, and did not need to explain to those who understood. He controlled a significant portion of the district's informal economy, loans, properties, import logistics that existed in the gray space between legal and otherwise. He was not the kind of man who appeared in newspapers or police briefings. He was the kind of man that other men mentioned carefully, in lowered voices, usually when explaining to someone else why a particular situation had already been resolved. His rules were few but absolute. No chaos for its own sake, no involvement of innocents, and never under any arrangement, for any sum, for any reason, the abuse of a woman. This last rule was not policy, it was personal. Camila Mora had been born on a Tuesday in October, the 7th child of a family that had very little and distributed it carefully. Francisco had been 12. He remembered standing in the doorway of the room where his mother was recovering, looking at the small, red, furious face of his youngest sister, and feeling something settle in his chest that he did not have a word for at the time. He had one later. Responsibility. Camila was 8 months old when the family understood she could not hear. The word the doctor used was profound. Profound hearing loss. Francisco had sat with that word for days, turning it over, trying to understand why it felt like a verdict rather than a description. He had been 15 when he decided that if the world was going to make Camila navigate it in silence, the least he could do was learn to meet her there. He found books. He found a woman 3 streets over who taught him for 2 hours every Saturday morning in exchange for help moving boxes in her storage room. He practiced in the evenings, his fingers forming shapes in the lamplight of the bedroom he shared with 2 brothers, until the shapes became words, and the words became fluent, and Camila could look at his hands and laugh. He had been 19 when Camila died, a different kind of accident than the word usually implies. The kind of accident that occurs when a young, deaf woman cannot hear a man approaching from behind on a poorly lit stairwell. The kind that is investigated briefly and filed away quickly in a city that had other priorities. Francisco had not filed it away. He had carried it instead folded small and placed somewhere beneath his ribs, where it did not impede function, but never fully disappeared. It informed everything. The rules he lived by. The particular cold that came into his eyes when certain lines were crossed. The reason he still moved his hands sometimes in the old shapes when he was thinking, a habit so ingrained he no longer noticed it. The reason that, on a misty Wednesday night on Callum Street, when a woman in a green dress dropped her free hand to her waist and shaped 2 careful sentences in the space between one breath and the next, Francisco Mora did not miss a single word. He had clocked them 30 feet out. Not because they appeared obviously wrong. Derek was practiced enough to ensure they didn't, but because Francisco read bodies the way other men read faces, and what Isabella's body was saying bore no relationship to what the scene was presenting. Her shoulders were pulled inward. Her stride was controlled in the specific way of someone controlling it deliberately. Her eyes moved forward without curiosity, without the natural drift of a person walking a familiar street. She was not walking. She was being walked. The man behind her large hooded leather jacket, worn and creased, had his right arm angled in a way that made no anatomical sense for a casual grip. The angle spoke to something held below and inward. Francisco had seen that angle before. He catalogued all of this in the time it took to cover 15 feet. Then her hand moved. He saw it before he registered that he was seeing it the way the body sometimes processes things the conscious mind is still catching up to. Her fingers shaped the first word, and something in him went very quiet. The particular quiet that precedes precision. Help me. His stride carried him one more step. The second sentence completed itself against the fabric of her skirt. He has a weapon. Francisco stopped. He looked at her face, then really looked at it. The swollen eyes. The careful, constructed blankness of a woman who had been managing terror for long enough that she had learned to wear it quietly. The way she held the handbag strap like it was the last ordinary thing she had. Something moved behind his ribs, old and familiar. He looked at Derek. Derek had already made his assessment and arrived at his conclusion, the flat, dismissive evaluation of a man who sees a stranger and decides, in under a second, that the stranger is not a variable worth adjusting for. That was his mistake. Francisco's voice, when it came, was almost pleasant. Let her go. Derek laughed. It was a short sound, dismissive. The kind of laugh that is less about humor and more about establishing hierarchy. A sound men like Derek deployed the way others deploy words, to communicate that the person in front of them had fundamentally misunderstood the situation. Walk away, Derek said. His voice was low, unhurried, confident in the way of men who have not yet encountered the specific consequence that recalibrates that confidence. This doesn't involve you. Francisco did not move. He stood in the amber wash of the street lamp, with his hands loose at his sides, his tattooed fingers relaxed, his face carrying the same unreadable stillness it had carried since he turned onto Callum Street. He was not performing calm. He simply was calm, in the way that deep water is calm not because nothing is happening beneath the surface, but because the surface has learned not to reflect it. I'm making it my business, Francisco said quietly. Derek's jaw tightened. His grip on Isabella's elbow shifted a small, reflexive adjustment, the kind a man makes when he is redistributing his attention between 2 problems and has not yet decided which one is primary. His right arm, the one angled inward at Isabella's side, did not move. The knife stayed where it was. But his eyes moved to Francisco. That was the mistake, not the only one he would make tonight. But the first. Isabella felt the change in his grip, the way you feel a knot beginning to loosen incrementally, barely, but real. She had been measuring it for 11 minutes, the exact pressure of his fingers against her elbow, the way it varied when his attention was fully on her versus when something pulled it sideways. She had been waiting, with a patience born entirely of desperation, for a variation large enough to mean something. This was it. She did not think. Thinking had been what she'd been doing for 6 months, careful, measured, exhausting thinking that had moved her to a new town, and a new apartment, and a new routine, and had delivered her, ultimately, to this misty street with a knife at her side. Thinking had its limits. She had reached them. She pushed. Her left shoulder drove back and into Derek's chest, not powerfully. She was not built for power, but with the sharp, a sudden commitment of someone who has accepted that the next 5 seconds will determine everything. Derek's grip broke. Not completely. His fingers dragged against her cardigan as she lurched forward, pulling the fabric sideways, and she heard him make a sound surprise more than pain. And then she was stumbling 2 steps ahead, and turning, and the knife was no longer against her side. Everything happened in the space of a breath. Francisco was already moving before she cleared Derek's reach. Not running, he did not run. He covered the distance in 3 long, rapid strides that made no wasted motion. And by the time Derek had processed the fact that Isabella had moved and swung his attention back forward, Francisco was already inside his space. He caught Derek's knife hand at the wrist. The grip he applied was not brute force, it was geometry. 2 fingers pressed against the specific junction of tendon and bone on the inside of Derek's wrist, where the body's own architecture works against it. And he rotated inward and down in a single motion that combined Derek's own momentum with physics he had no way to resist. Derek's arm folded. His hand opened involuntarily. The knife left his fingers and struck the wet cobblestones with a sound that was surprisingly small for something that had controlled the last 11 minutes of Isabella's life. It spun once, came to rest in a puddle, went still. Derek was not finished. He swung with his free arm wide, poorly angled, the swing of a man reacting rather than thinking, and Francisco stepped inside it, let it pass across his shoulder, and drove his forearm into Derek's chest. The impact was precise, and it was enough. Derek's back met the brick wall behind him, with a force that emptied the air from his lungs in a single hard exhale. He slid. His hood fell back. His face, exposed now in the lamplight, was broad and weathered, and currently registering an emotion it had likely not registered in some time. Confusion, then pain, then a darkness that arrived quickly and completely as Francisco's elbow connected with the side of his jaw in one final, efficient movement. Derek folded onto the wet cobblestones and did not get up. The street went silent. Not the tense, listening silence of before something different now. Emptied. As though the night had been holding its breath for 11 minutes and had finally, quietly, released it. Mist drifted between the lampposts. The distant headlights had not moved. Somewhere above them, water dripped from a gutter in an irregular rhythm that was the only sound left. Francisco straightened his jacket. He looked at Derek for 2 seconds, not with satisfaction, not with anything that resembled emotion, assessing, confirming. Then he turned. Isabella had not run. She stood 4 feet away on the glistening cobblestones, her green dress damp and twisted at the hip from where Derek had grabbed at her. Her beige cardigan pulled off one shoulder. Her handbag still clutched in both hands now, as though it were a fixed point in a world that had just tilted violently on its axis. Her chest was rising and falling rapidly. Her eyes, already swollen from an evening of weeping before any of this had begun, were wide and fixed on Francisco's face. She was looking at him the way people look at something they cannot immediately classify. Not fear, not relief. Something between them that had not yet decided what it was. Francisco raised his hand slowly and signed, "You are safe." 3 words. Simple shapes. Formed with the same unhurried precision with which he did everything, his tattooed fingers moving clearly in the amber light, making certain she could read every letter. Something in Isabella's face broke open. Not gently. Not the way relief is supposed to arrive quietly, gradually, like color returning to a room. It broke the way things break after they have been held together past their limit. Her shoulders dropped first, then her chin. A sound came out of her that was not a word, and not quite a cry, something rawer than either, something that had been compressed into a very small space for a very long time. She wept. Standing in the middle of Callum Street in the rain, her green dress soaked at the hem, her handbag hanging from fingers that had finally stopped gripping quite so hard, Isabella Aaron wept with the absolute, undignified completeness of a woman who had just run out of the last of whatever had been keeping her upright. Francisco did not look away. He did not fill the silence. He simply waited still, steady, present while the night held them both. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had no name on the door and no number visible from the street. Francisco had 3 such places across the district, not safe houses in the dramatic sense, not rooms stocked with weapons and contingency plans, but quiet spaces, unremarkable, the kind of addresses that did not appear in conversations. He brought Isabella here because it was closest. That was the only calculation he made. She had not asked where they were going. She had walked beside him from Callum Street through 2 turns and a narrow passage between buildings, with the quiet compliance of someone whose body had simply transferred its obedience from one instruction to another. He had noticed this and said nothing. There would be time. The apartment was warm and plainly furnished. A table, 4 chairs, a sofa the color of slate, a kitchen with a kettle that Francisco filled and switched on without asking, because in his experience people who had spent an hour in the cold being frightened needed something hot in their hands before they needed anything else. Isabella sat at the table. She had stopped crying on Grenville Road, not because the feeling had passed, but because she had reached the specific exhaustion that exists on the other side of it. Her eyes were dry now, and very still. She had set her handbag on the table in front of her, and placed both hands flat beside it, as though reassuring herself the surface was solid. Francisco set a mug in front of her, sat across the table, said nothing. She looked at him for a long moment, at the tattoos on his hands resting on the table, at the calm, undemanding quality of his attention. He was not watching her the way people watch someone they expect to perform recovery on a schedule. He was simply present, in the way of someone who understood that silence was not always a void that needed filling. She picked up the mug, held it, then she began. She told him about Thomas first. Not the accident, she was not ready to call it that tonight. Not after everything but Thomas as he had been. The quiet man who made coffee too strong and forgot to replace the milk, and had a habit of reading 3 books simultaneously, leaving them face down and splayed across every flat surface in the apartment, until she had complained about it so many times. It became a joke between them, and then a memory she could not touch without it costing her something. She told him about the hospital corridor, the doctor's measured language, the nodding she still did not remember doing. She told him about the loan document on the coffee table and Matthias sitting with his ankle crossed over his knee. She told him about the marriage proposal, delivered in the same measured voice, as though it were a reasonable administrative solution to a mathematical problem. She told him about the calls and the visits and the men who appeared near her house, about standing in her doorway and hearing you belong to this family and understanding, with a clarity that was almost physical, that there was no version of staying that ended safely. She told him about the new apartment, the 2 bags, the Wednesday morning departure in the dark. She told him about tonight, Grayford Road, the voice that said walk, the 11 minutes on Callum Street that she had spent deciding whether she was going to survive or simply endure whatever came next. Throughout all of it, Francisco did not interrupt. He did not lean forward with the performed engagement of someone demonstrating that they were listening. He simply listened, absorbing everything with the same stillness he carried in his body. His dark eyes on her face, his tattooed hands resting quietly on the table between them. When she finished, the kettle had long gone cold, and her mug was empty, and the apartment was very quiet. Francisco was silent for a moment longer. Then he said, "I will handle it." 4 words. No elaboration. No list of methods or assurances or explanations of what handling it would mean. Just the statement, placed on the table between them as plainly as he had placed the mug. Isabella looked at his face and understood, with the particular instinct of a woman who had spent 6 months learning to read the gap between what men said and what they meant, that these 4 words were exactly what they appeared to be. Not a performance, not a negotiation opening, a fact about the immediate future. She nodded once, looked down at her empty mug. "I don't know why you're doing this," she said quietly. Francisco considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "You asked?" he said finally. She looked up. He gestured briefly with his right hand, the old, familiar shape of it, the sign she had made on Callum Street, and she understood that he meant this precisely. She had asked, in the only language available to her in that moment, and he had heard. That was the entirety of his explanation. She found she could not argue with it. Across the district, in a room above a dry-cleaning business on Pemworth Street that served as the administrative center of Matthias Aaron's various operations, Derek regained consciousness on the floor of a car that smelled of cigarettes and old upholstery. His jaw screamed. His wrist was worse. The man in the driver's seat did not ask how he was feeling. He asked what had happened. Derek told him, in the fractured, effortful sentences of someone operating with a partially functional jaw, everything he could reconstruct from the 11 minutes on Callum Street. The woman, the man in the black suit, the speed of it, the specific, terrible efficiency of how quickly everything had stopped being under control. The driver said nothing. He drove. Matthias was waiting in the room above the dry cleaning shop, seated behind a desk that was too large for the space, which was, Francisco would have recognized this immediately, entirely intentional. He listened to Derek's account with his fingers laced together on the desk in front of him, and his expression arranged in the particular configuration of a man who is deciding how to respond rather than simply responding. When Derek finished, Matthias was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. It began as a short sound and expanded, filling the room, the genuine laugh of a man who has heard something he finds absurd. A woman, a stranger on the street. His men, undone by a widow in a green dress who had apparently decided to involve a passerby. He shook his head, drew breath to say something dismissive. Then Derek said the name. The laugh stopped. Matthias's hands, still laced together on the desk, tightened almost imperceptibly. The color of the room seemed to change, or perhaps it was simply the quality of his attention that changed, sharpening into something considerably less amused. "Say that again," Matthias said quietly. Derek said it again. Matthias unclasped his hands, placed them flat on the desk, stared at the surface between them for a long moment, recalculating something that had, until 30 seconds ago, seemed very straightforward. The situation, it turned out, was not straightforward at all. The dry cleaning business on Pemworth Street opened at 8 every morning and closed at 6 every evening, and in the 11 years Matthias Aaron had operated out of the room above it, no one had ever arrived uninvited. Francisco Mora arrived at 10 the following morning. He did not knock loudly. He did not send word ahead. He walked through the front of the shop, past the plastic-wrapped garments rotating slowly on their carousel, past the woman behind the counter, who looked up and then looked immediately back down, with the practiced incuriosity of someone who had learned that certain visitors were not hers to acknowledge, and up the narrow staircase at the Enio, back without pausing. The man stationed at the top of the stairs put a hand on Francisco's chest. Francisco looked at the hand, then at the man. The man removed the hand, stepped aside. Francisco opened the door. The room was exactly what he had expected. Large desk positioned to dominate. 2 chairs placed at a distance that was designed to feel slightly too far, close enough for conversation, far enough to remind the visitor of the geography of power. A window behind Matthias's chair that placed his face in partial shadow while illuminating whoever sat across from him. Details assembled by a man who had read about intimidation and mistaken the reading for understanding. Matthias was standing when Francisco entered. This was a recalibration. He had intended to be seated, Francisco could tell, but the name had evidently disrupted his staging. He was broader than Francisco, heavier, his dark hair silver at the temples in a way he had likely decided was distinguished. He wore a charcoal suit that was expensive and fitted, and communicated wealth loudly enough to suggest he was not entirely confident it would communicate itself. His eyes, when they settled on Francisco, were the eyes of a man performing an assessment while pretending not to. "Francisco Mora," he said, making it a statement rather than a greeting, establishing that he knew the name, that the name had not arrived without context. "Matthias," Francisco said, "not Mr. Aaron, just the first name, quietly, the way you name something you are not impressed by." He crossed the room without being invited to sit, pulled one of the chairs a foot closer to the desk, a small adjustment, unhurried, and sat down. He placed an envelope on the desk in front of him, did not push it across yet, left it there between them like a fact awaiting acknowledgement. Matthias sat. He looked at the envelope, then at Francisco. "You put one of my men in hospital," he said. "Your man put a knife in a widow's ribs," Francisco said, "on a public street, at night." He let that sit for a moment. "I found the situation imbalanced." Matthias's jaw shifted slightly. "She owes a debt. She offered to repay it. The arrangement changed." "You changed it," Francisco said, "without her agreement. That is not how debt works. That is how ownership works." He paused. "These are different things." Matthias leaned back in his chair, laced his fingers together on the desk, the same gesture Derek had watched him make the night before, though Francisco did not know this and would not have found it interesting if he had. "You've spoken to her." "I have." "Then you know the full picture." "I know her picture," Francisco said. "I'm here to understand yours." This appeared to catch Matthias slightly off guard, the directness of it, the absence of the hostility he had prepared for. He studied Francisco for a moment, recalibrating again. My brother owed me a significant sum. He died without settling it. The debt transfers to his estate, Francisco said, not to his wife's body. The room was very quiet. Matthias smiled. It was the smile of a man who has decided to find something charming rather than threatening, because the alternative requires him to feel something he would prefer not to feel. You're here to negotiate. I'm here to settle. Francisco pushed the envelope across the desk. Matthias did not open it immediately. He looked at it with the careful neutrality of a man who will not allow himself to appear impressed by anything before he has decided whether being impressed is strategically appropriate. Then he picked it up, opened it, looked at the contents. Whatever figure he had expected, this was not it. Something moved briefly across his face, not gratitude, not relief, but the involuntary flicker of a man whose financial arithmetic has just been interrupted by an unexpected variable. He set the envelope back on the desk. This covers the principal, he said. And the interest, Francisco said. I had it calculated independently. The figure is accurate. Matthias looked at him. You had it calculated. Last night. Another silence. Matthias tapped the envelope once with 2 fingers. Then he leaned forward, and the smile returned. But it was different now, stripped of its earlier warmth, wearing its actual face, which was considerably less pleasant. You're a practical man, Francisco. I respect that. But you're misunderstanding something fundamental. He paused for effect. This stopped being about the money a long time ago. I know, Francisco said. That's what concerns me. She's Thomas's widow. She belongs with this family. She belongs to herself, Francisco said. The words were quiet and simple and carried no heat, which somehow made them land harder than anger would have. She does not love you. You cannot negotiate feeling. You cannot collect it as a debt. And you cannot send men with knives into the street to retrieve it. Matthias's expression settled into something flat and cold. The performance was over. You're involving yourself in something that will cost you considerably more than the contents of that envelope. Perhaps. Francisco stood, straightened his jacket, looked down at Matthias with the calm, untroubled gaze of a man who has assessed the threat and filed it accordingly. Leave her alone. The debt is settled. This is finished. He walked to the door. If you leave this building, Matthias said behind him, quietly, and you continue involving yourself in my family's affairs, you will regret it. I promise you that. Francisco paused at the door, did not turn around. You should open that envelope again, he said. Look at how quickly I put that together. He opened the door. Then ask yourself what else I can put together quickly. He left without closing it behind him. Matthias sat alone in the room above the dry cleaning shop for a long time, his hands flat on the desk, the envelope between them, staring at the open door. He was thinking. But he was thinking the wrong thoughts. He was thinking about what he could do to Francisco Mora. He was not yet thinking about what Francisco Mora could do to him. That understanding would come. But it would come too late. Matthias Aaron made his decision at 11:47 that night. Francisco would know the precise time later, from a man who had been in the room and understood the value of accurate information delivered to the right person. The decision itself was not complicated. Matthias had sat with the open door and the envelope on his desk for most of the day, rotating through his options with the methodical patience of a man who trusted his own judgment, absolutely, and had rarely encountered evidence that suggested he shouldn't. By evening, he had arrived at his conclusion. Francisco Mora had walked into his office, placed money on his desk as though settling a bill at a restaurant, told him what he could and could not do with his own family, and walked out. The money was real. The calculation was accurate. None of that was the point. The point was the walkout, the open door, the particular quality of Francisco's departure, unhurried, unafraid, the exit of a man who had not felt the need to look back. Matthias could not absorb that. It was not in his architecture. He made 3 phone calls. Then he sent 4 men to Isabella's apartment on Crestfield Lane. They arrived at 12:20, 2 at the front entrance, 2 at the rear. Clean, coordinated, the kind of approach that suggested Matthias had resources beyond Derek and his predecessors. The man at the front tried the buzzer first, apartment 14. The name beside it recently changed, a detail that had taken Matthias's people less than a day to find. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. They went in through the rear entrance at 12:26. Apartment 14 was empty. Not abandoned, the furniture was in place. A cup sat beside the kitchen sink. A book lay face down on the sofa arm in the unconscious way of someone who intended to return to it. But the things that indicated a person's actual presence, a phone charger, a coat on the hook by the door, the specific accumulation of small daily objects that makes a space inhabited rather than merely furnished, were gone. She had been moved. The man at the front called Matthias at 12:31 and delivered this information in the flat, careful tone of someone who understood that the content of the message would determine the temperature of the response. Matthias said nothing for a moment. Then he said to find out where she had gone and ended the call. He sat in the dark above the dry cleaning shop and understood, with a cold and gradually expanding clarity, that Francisco Mora had anticipated him. Isabella did not know about the 4 men until the following morning. She had spent the night in another of Francisco's unremarkable addresses, a flat above a printing business on Quarry Street, 2 rooms, adequate heat, the low rhythmic sound of the city outside. Francisco had moved her the previous afternoon, shortly after returning from Pemworth Street. He had said only that it was a precaution. She had looked at his face when he said it and understood it was more than that, but she had not pressed. She was learning the particular economy of his communication, that he said what was necessary, and that what was necessary was always accurate, which was more than she could say for most people she had trusted. She had slept. This surprised her. She had expected to lie awake, cataloging the events of Callum Street, replaying Derek's grip and the cold pressure of the blade and the specific quality of the terror that had walked with her for 11 minutes. Instead, she had fallen into a deep and dreamless sleep within 20 minutes of lying down, her body apparently having made a unilateral decision that it had spent enough of its resources on vigilance and was collecting the debt. She woke to gray morning light and the smell of coffee, and Francisco sitting at the small table near the window with his phone on the surface in front of him, his dark eyes moving to her when she appeared in the doorway. He told her about the 4 men. He told her about the empty apartment, the coordinated approach, the evidence that Matthias's reach extended faster and further than a single night should have allowed. He told her without softening it, without the particular condescension of people who believe that managing someone's access to bad news is a form of kindness. He told her the way you tell someone the weather directly, completely, because they needed to make decisions about what to wear. Isabella sat down, wrapped both hands around the coffee mug he had placed across the table from his own. "He's not going to stop," she said. "Not a question." "Not yet," Francisco said. She looked at the mug. "The negotiation didn't work. The negotiation established something useful," Francisco said. "He knows the debt is settled. Whatever he does from here, he can't dress it as finance. He has to wear what it actually is." "And what is it actually?" "Obsession," Francisco said. "Men who cannot accept being left tend to escalate when confronted with evidence that they have been." He paused. "The escalation tells me what I needed to know." "What did you need to know?" He looked at her steadily. "That he won't respond to reason. That the next conversation cannot be a conversation." The flat was very quiet. Outside, the city moved through its morning ordinary, indifferent, entirely unaware of the specific crisis being navigated in the 2 rooms above the printing business on Quarry Street. Isabella set her mug down. When she looked up, there was something different in her expression, not the managed blankness of Callum Street, not the broken exhaustion of the safe house table, not the careful gratitude of the past 24 hours. Something that had been absent from her face for 6 months was beginning, tentatively, to return. Not hope exactly, too early for hope. Something harder than hope. Something that looked forward rather than sideways. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Francisco considered the question. He was accustomed to people asking what he would do for them, what he could provide, what his protection cost. He was not accustomed to being asked what he needed. The distinction registered. "Nothing," he said. "Stay here. Stay away from the windows." He stood, picked up his phone. "I have some conversations to have." Isabella watched him move toward the door, the same unhurried, inevitable quality of movement she had first seen from 30 feet away, on a misty street, walking toward her through the amber dark. "Francisco," she said. He stopped, turned. She held his gaze. "Be careful." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved briefly behind his eyes, not quite surprise, but adjacent to it. The expression of a man encountering something he had not accounted for in his calculations. Then he nodded once and left. The door closed quietly behind him. Isabella turned back to her coffee, her hands steady around the mug, and began for the first time in 6 months to think about what came after. Francisco made 4 phone calls between Quarry Street and his office on Belden Road. The first was to a man named Rourke, who handled municipal records and possessed an extraordinary memory for the kind of paperwork that organizations like Matthias Ahrens generated when they believed nobody sufficiently motivated was paying attention. The second was to a woman named Petra, who managed 3 legitimate businesses in the district and had, over 7 years of careful observation, developed a precise understanding of which of her competitors' operations were genuine and which were performing genuineness for a regulatory audience. The third was to a former police detective named Calloway, who had retired under circumstances that remained technically unresolved, and who exchanged information with Francisco under an arrangement that had suited both parties for longer than either officially acknowledged. The fourth call was the shortest, 2 sentences, a name and an address. The man on the other end said he understood and ended the call without ceremony. Francisco put his phone in his pocket and walked the remaining distance to Belden Road in the early morning quiet of a city not yet fully awake. He had not slept. He did not appear to require it in the way other men did, or if he did, he had learned to defer the requirement until circumstances permitted, which they currently did not. He sat behind his desk in the plane, ordered office above the hardware shop, and opened a folder Rourke had sent to his email at 6 that morning. 41 pages of financial documentation, property records, company registrations, and licensing agreements that mapped the architecture of Matthias Ahrens' operation with the kind of granular clarity that only becomes possible when someone who knows precisely where to look decides to look there. Francisco read all 41 pages without interruption. He marked 7. Then he began. It did not look like dismantling from the outside. It looked, to anyone moving through the district that Wednesday, like an ordinary day. Deliveries arrived and departed on schedule. Businesses opened their shutters at their usual hours. People navigated their routines with the comfortable unconsciousness of people who had somewhere to be and were going there. Nothing appeared disrupted. Nothing announced itself as the beginning of an ending. Petra made 2 calls to suppliers who maintained long-standing arrangements with a property management company that existed, on paper, as one of Matthias's cleaner operations. She did not threaten. She did not reference Matthias by name. She simply extended an alternative offer, better terms, more reliable structure, the kind of long-term stability that an organization navigating significant uncertainty could not honestly promise. Both suppliers said they would consider it. By early afternoon, both had quietly updated their arrangements. Calloway walked into the district licensing office with 3 documents and a conversation with someone he had known for 11 years. By close of business, 2 of Matthias's establishments had been flagged for regulatory inspection. Not raided, not shuttered. Simply flagged the administrative equivalent of a hand placed firmly on a shoulder, communicating without ambiguity that sustained, specific attention had arrived and intended to remain. The 4 men Matthias had sent to Crestfield Lane 2 nights prior found, across the course of the day, that their usual contacts had become unavailable. Not hostile, not explicitly warned away, simply unreachable, busy, unresponsive, suddenly occupied with other priorities in the particular way that people become occupied when someone whose judgment they respect more than yours has quietly suggested that availability might not serve them well right now. By evening, Matthias's operation was not destroyed, but it had become aware of itself in an entirely new way. It could feel the pressure of the ground beneath it. That sensation, unfamiliar, destabilizing, arriving without a clear face to direct anger toward, was precisely what Francisco had intended it to feel. Matthias felt it too. He received information across the day in pieces, each piece individually containable. Collectively assembling a picture, he kept attempting to reframe as coincidence, and kept failing to sustain that framing against the accumulating weight of evidence. A supplier gone quiet. A licensing flag. 2 men unable to reach intermediaries they had relied on for years. A property query filed by a firm whose connections, when investigated, pointed consistently in one direction. By 7 that evening, he had stopped pretending the pieces were unrelated. He made calls. He reached out to men who owed him, men with resources and reach, men who operated in spaces that intersected with Francisco Mora's and who might Matthias calculated, working through his options with the systematic patience of a man who had never previously encountered a problem his network could not absorb, have their own motivations for wanting that particular operation disrupted. Most listened politely. Two said they would see what was possible. Neither called back. Francisco drove to Pemworth Street at 9 that evening. He parked on the adjacent road and walked. The dry cleaning shop was dark at the front, the carousel of plastic-wrapped garments still behind the shuttered glass. The light above the rear staircase was on. He went in through the back, up the narrow stairs. The man who had been stationed at the top yesterday was not there. The landing was empty. He opened the door. Matthias was alone. Francisco assessed this in the time it took to cross the threshold, and concluded it was miscalculation rather than bravery. The two things resembled each other most closely, in the moments before their consequences diverged. The large desk remained. The envelope from the previous day was still on its surface, opened, its contents placed to one side with the careful neutrality of something a man has looked at many times and not resolved. Matthias was standing at the window when Francisco entered, hands clasped behind his back, looking down at the street below. He did not turn immediately. Francisco recognized the performance, the composed man surveying his territory, unhurried by arrival. He waited for it to finish. Matthias turned. His face had changed since yesterday. The architecture of confidence that had structured his expressions throughout that first meeting, the managed smile, the performed authority of the oversized desk, and the shadowed window had developed visible fractures. Not collapse. The structure was still standing, but standing the way things stand when the load has exceeded what they were built for and the material has begun, invisibly, to fail. "You've been busy," Matthias said. "I told you to consider what I could put together quickly," Francisco said, crossing the room and stopping in its center. "I wanted you to see it. Suppliers, licensing paperwork, some conversations." Matthias kept his voice measured. "This isn't finished." "No," Francisco agreed. "It isn't. That's your choice." He held the other man's gaze without heat, without the performance of threat. "The licensing flags are the beginning. The property registrations are being reviewed by people who will find exactly what they are looking for, because I have told them precisely where to look. Your operation runs on the assumption that the attention it receives is general and manageable. What I am directing at it is specific and patient. I can sustain this attention for as long as is required." He paused. "You cannot sustain the operation while I do. The arithmetic is not complicated." Matthias was quiet. The room was quiet around him, the particular quiet of a man whose internal calculations are running faster than his face is able to conceal. "You're doing all of this," he said, "for a woman who didn't even know your name 4 days ago." "She asked for help," Francisco said. "I am providing it. That is the complete account." He let that sit. "Leave the district tonight. Don't return. What remains of your operation can dissolve on its own time without my involvement. That is the offer. It does not improve with negotiation." Something moved across Matthias's face. Not rage. Rage would have been easier, more legible, something more complicated and more costly. The expression of a man who has pursued a single objective with such consuming focus that he has not, until this moment, looked directly at what the pursuit has made him, what he has dismantled in himself in service of something that was never love, and never could be made into it. He looked away. Francisco waited 2 seconds. Then he turned and walked to the door without another word, without looking back, with the same unhurried certainty that had characterized every movement he had made since Callum Street. Behind him, he heard Matthias exhale, a long, pressurized sound, the sound of a structure releasing what it could no longer hold. On the street below, the city continued its ordinary night. By midnight, Matthias Aaron had left the district. He took one bag. He did not inform his remaining men. He did not say goodbye to anyone, because there was, when he examined the landscape of his life honestly, no one to say it to. He did not return. Francisco arrived at Quarry Street at 8 the following morning. He knocked twice in the pattern Isabella had learned over the past several days to identify without thinking a small, domestic detail that struck her. When she noticed herself recognizing it, as evidence of how thoroughly her situation had rearranged what she considered ordinary, she opened the door. He came in carrying 2 coffees from the corner place, and set one in front of her with the same unhurried efficiency with which he did everything, and sat across the table, and told her. Matthias was gone. The operation had fractured with his departure enforcement loyalty being, in Francisco's experience, largely conditional on the continued functioning of the structure that provided it. The men sent to Crestfield Lane had scattered. The licensing flags remained on record. The suppliers had not returned. The property reviews were ongoing, and would proceed to their conclusions without requiring further input from Francisco. It was finished. Isabella sat across the table with both hands around her coffee cup and absorbed this information in the same way she had learned to absorb everything over the past 6 months, carefully, checking it from multiple angles before allowing herself to fully occupy it. She had been disappointed by certainties before. She had built careful structures of relief on foundations that turned out to be provisional. But Francisco did not deal in provisional. She had understood this about him by the second morning. "He's not coming back," she said. "No." She nodded slowly, set the cup down, and then experienced something she had not anticipated and could not have precisely predicted. Not the dramatic release she might have expected, not tears, not the visible architecture of relief arriving at last after long delay. Instead, a profound and slightly disorienting stillness. Like a sound she had been hearing for so long it had ceased to register as sound, and simply become the texture of silence had stopped, and what it left behind was not peace exactly, but the precondition of peace, space that had not previously existed. She did not know, immediately, what to do with it. Francisco drank his coffee and did not fill the silence with anything. This was one of the things she had come to understand about him. He did not treat silence as a problem requiring solution. He inhabited it the way he inhabited rooms, without apology, without the restless performance of a man uncomfortable with stillness. After a while she said, "I keep waiting for the other thing." "What other thing?" "The condition," she said. "The thing that comes after the help. There's always something that comes after." She looked at him steadily. "You paid his debt. You moved me twice. You've spent 4 days dismantling his operation." She paused. "Nobody does that without wanting something in return." Francisco considered her words with the seriousness she had learned he applied to things that deserved it. He did not immediately reassure her, did not produce the quick, smooth denial of a man who has a prepared answer. He sat with the question. "My sister's name was Camila," he said. Isabella went still. She was deaf. I learned sign language to speak with her. He turned the coffee cup once on the table surface. "She died when she was 19. In circumstances that involved a man who believed that her inability to hear him coming made her available." His voice carried no performance of grief. It was flat and factual, the way he described everything, which somehow made it land with more weight than anguish would have. "I could not help her. I was in a different city. By the time I knew, there was nothing left to do but know." The apartment was very quiet. "On Callum Street," he said. "You used her language to ask for help. And I was there." He looked at her directly. "That is the complete account of my motivation. There is no condition behind it." Isabella held his gaze for a long moment. She was looking at him the way she had looked at him on Callum Street, after he signed, "You are safe," trying to classify something that did not fit her existing categories. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "About Camila." He nodded once, accepted it without deflection or minimization. She reached across the table and picked up the envelope he had placed there the previous day, the one she had not opened, had not touched since he slid it toward her. She turned it in her hands. "For my life," she said, repeating his words back to him. "Not for you. Not for me," he confirmed. She set it down, did not open it. But she did not push it back across the table either, which Francisco understood, correctly, as her version of acceptance. "I'll pay you back," she said. "Not because I feel obligated, because I want to." Something in his expression shifted barely, the way things shifted in Francisco's face, in the margins rather than the center. "If it matters to you," he said. "It does." He nodded, picked up his coffee. Outside, the morning moved through its routines indifferent, continuous, making no accommodation for the fact that something had ended in the 2 rooms above the printing business on Quarry Street, or that something else, tentative and unannounced, had quietly begun. "What do I do now?" Isabella asked, not helplessly, practically, the question of a person looking at cleared ground and beginning to consider what to build. Francisco looked at her across the table, at the woman who had walked 11 minutes in terror on a wet street and found, in the last available second, the presence of mind to speak in the one language that could save her, who had sat across from him in the safe house and told the complete truth without softening it, who had asked him, that first morning, what he needed, a question so few people thought to ask, that he still had not entirely resolved where to put it. "You already know," he said. She held his gaze. Then she looked down at the table, and across her face, quietly, without drama, the way the most significant things tend to arrive, something shifted. A curtain opening, light finding its way into a room that had been dark for a long time, falling across everything still there, still recoverable, still hers. She almost smiled. "Live well," she said, testing the words, seeing how they fit. He looked at her steadily. "That's enough." Isabella returned to the apartment on Crestfield Lane on a Thursday afternoon. She took the bus rather than a cab, a small decision, entirely practical, but one that required her to sit among strangers without scanning each face for recognition, without positioning herself near the exit, without running the quiet background calculation that had accompanied every public moment for 6 months. She sat by the window and watched the district move past the glass, and practiced, consciously, the unfamiliar discipline of simply looking at things without assessing them for threat. It was harder than she expected, easier than she feared. She let herself into the building, climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, put her key in the lock of apartment 14. She paused in the doorway for a moment, taking inventory not of danger but of what remained. The furniture in its place. The gray morning light through curtains she had closed on the night Derek appeared on Grayford Road. The book on the sofa arm, still face down, exactly where she had left it in the last ordinary moment, before everything divided into before and after. She walked to the sofa, picked the book up, looked at the page she had been on. She remembered nothing of it, could not have said what paragraph she had been reading when the knock came. She set it on the side table, properly, right side up. Then she opened the curtains. Light came in ordinary Thursday light, unheroic and sufficient, falling across the furniture and the floor and the accumulated small geography of a life interrupted and now resumed. She stood at the window and looked down at the street below. A woman with a shopping bag, 2 men in conversation outside the newsagent, a child pulling against a parent's hand toward something more interesting than the direction they were heading. No one watching, no car idling, no figure conducting a patient inventory of who came and went through the front entrance. Just a street being a street, indifferent and alive, and entirely unconcerned with her specifically. She allowed herself to feel this, all of it, without immediately moving to the next thing. It took longer than she expected. Safety, she discovered, did not install itself completely upon arrival. It moved in gradually, claiming territory room by room, day by day. It was there in the first morning she made coffee, without listening for the sound of footsteps on the stairs. It was there in the first evening she fell asleep, before finishing her assessment of the sounds outside. It accumulated in small, undramatic increments, until one day she noticed it had become the ambient condition of her life, rather than something she was actively constructing. She enrolled in the event management course at Ferris Street College. The application took 40 minutes. She sat at her kitchen table and completed every field and submitted it before she could locate a reason not to. Because the version of herself that cataloged reasons not to had spent 6 months keeping her careful and small, and she was finished letting that version lead. She began running in the mornings. Not to escape anything. Not from the anxious compulsion of someone who needs movement to manage fear. Simply because the streets in the early light were quiet and hers and she had spent enough time inside. She called her sister, whom she had not spoken to honestly in 8 months, and told her most of the truth. Not all. Some of it was not yet hers to distribute, but enough. Her sister cried. Isabella did not, which surprised them both. She did not see Francisco during this time. She understood he was present in the district. The infrastructure of his world continued its operation in the same streets she now walked with increasing ease. But he did not seek her out, and she had come to understand this as a form of respect rather than absence. He had done what he said he would do. He was not the kind of man who required the ongoing acknowledgement of it. She thought about him differently than she thought about the other elements of that period. Derek, the knife, Matthias, the 11 minutes on Callum Street, these she processed, the way difficult material is processed, non-linearly, in fragments, returning to pieces of them until they became part of her history, rather than an interruption of it. Weighty but navigable, hers to carry rather than being carried by. Francisco occupied a category she had not previously had occasion to create. Not a rescuer, she resisted that word, because it flattened something that was more lateral, more mutual than it implied. A person who had been paying the right kind of attention at the right moment and had chosen, without hesitation and without condition, to act on what he saw. The specific and uncommon gift of being heard in the language you actually spoke, by someone capable of answering. She saw him on a Tuesday. She was coming out of Ferris Street College, folder under her arm. the particular satisfied tiredness of a productive afternoon settling into her shoulders, and he was on the opposite pavement in his black suit moving in the direction of Belden Road. He registered her before she saw him. She knew this because by the time she looked up from her bag, he had already stopped and was looking across at her with the calm, unhurried quality of attention that was simply how he engaged with things that mattered. She stopped too. They stood on opposite sides of the street. Traffic moved between them in its indifferent flow. She registered the tattoos visible at his collar and on the backs of his hands even from this distance. The black suit, the stillness of a man who had nowhere to be that was more important than where he currently was. She thought of Callum Street, of her fingers moving near the folds of her damp skirt, of the 4 seconds she had calculated and used. She shifted her folder under her arm, raised her free hand, and in the space between one passing car and the next, she formed the shapes clearly, slowly, with the confidence of someone who had practiced not the desperate compression of that night, fingers moving between heartbeats, but deliberately, fully, something given rather than something stolen from the margins of terror. "Thank you." Francisco looked at her hands, then at her face. His expression did not change in the ways that most people's expressions change. There was no broad performance of warmth, no smile deployed for the occasion, but something moved in it, quiet and real, in the particular interior way of a man who feels things he has long since learned not to display. His right hand rose, the tattooed fingers moved unhurried, fluent. The ease of a language that had never stopped living in his hands through all the years since a small girl with dark eyes had first taught him that silence was not the absence of communication, but simply another form of it. "Live well." Isabella looked at his hands, then at his face. She held his gaze across the moving street for a moment that was neither short nor long but simply complete the duration it needed to be, and no more. She nodded once. Then she turned and walked up Ferris Street in the afternoon light, folder under her arm, her steps carrying the quality she had been slowly, deliberately, day by day reclaiming the quality of someone moving toward something unfinished and open and worth the walking. She did not look back. On his side of the street, Francisco stood until she turned the corner and was gone. He did not move immediately afterward. He stood in the ordinary Tuesday afternoon with his hands at his sides and let the moment be what it was, complete, sufficient, requiring nothing added to it. He thought of Camila, briefly, the way he always did in moments like this, not with the weight of grief, which he had learned to carry without being governed by it, but with something quieter. Gratitude, perhaps, that the language she had given him had found its way, across all the years and distances between that lamplit bedroom and this street, to someone who needed it. He put his hands in his pockets, walked on. The street continued behind him, cobblestones wet from an earlier rain, street lamps not yet needed in the afternoon light, the city moving through its unremarkable Thursday business, with the total indifference of something too large and too continuous to register individual stories. But the stories were there, in the spaces between things, in the silence between words, in the movement of fingers that said what voices could not, on a misty street, at the last possible moment, available, always, to anyone paying the right kind of attention. Thanks for sticking with this story until the very end. You're the reason these stories feel alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to read your thoughts and connect with you in the comments.